Hello, and I will be reading from my story I have been writing. Be aware, this is far from finished. But I'll make sure to keep you guys updated on the story whenever I add more. And with that out of the way, we shall begin. Hello! This is the writer here. Before we begin this story, I will cover a few things about this world, the character, and their family. I know it might be a bit cliche, but I have a feeling it may or may not be useful info. So, away we go. This is a fantasy type world filled with all kinds of magic, from weak and simple magic to powerful and complex magic. There are also all sorts of wonderful creatures one might expect to see in a fantasy setting, such as dragons, godlike beings, and so much more. Now you have a bit of an idea of what kind of world setting this is. Now we move on to our character and their family. Our main character is an only child who lives with their parents, a busy and loving stay-at-home mother who makes amazing dinners, and a blacksmith father who normally comes home very late at night and wants to spend more time with his family. And our protagonist? Well, she is unique. For unlike everyone else in her village, she was born with blue hair, something that only happens every 6 generations. And what this means? Well, you may or may not figure that out. So, I hope this is enough info to get you started, and now we hop into the beginning of this story. Very far away in lands unknown, there is a small village that was in a mountainside where all sorts of magical beings live. In the village, there was a particular girl named Rose, who was recognized by her blue hair. The villagers thought there was never anyone quite as curious as her. Today, she was in quite an adventurous mood. As she was rushing back home to her village, she jumped across rocks on a river, swung across a gap using a strong vine, and climbed up an old ladder on a rocky cliffside in order to go back to her house in the village. Luckily for her, she had memorized this path back home quite well due to her many adventures outside her village home. In the village, as she was heading towards home, she saw many people about doing different things, like talking to each other about stuff. The builders were making new bridges and ramps to more places in the village. She stopped by a local bakery in order to buy a surprise treat for her mother. Once she had chosen a lovely cinnamon roll for her mum, she was back on her path to her comfy home to make her mother happy with the treat she had picked just for them. Finally, she was at the door of her house and swung open the door, bursting into the room, happy to be there and to see her mother, Heather. She greeted them with excitement and joy as she presented her mum with a present with her treat hidden inside the paper wrapping. She watched in anticipation as day opened it in front of her, and the happy look on her mother's face when she saw the cinnamon roll was worth it. As her mother placed it on the kitchen counter, they gave her a big old hug, thanking her for the lovely, tasty surprise she had brought her today, and in return, her mum gifted her a special emerald pendant to wear around her neck. After giving Rose the gift, her mother told them this pendant has magical powers hidden inside that were waiting to be unlocked by a special person, and that person was Rose. She rushed outside her house, heading to a sacred location outside the village. As she was doing so, she wondered in her mind what mystery power could it possibly be. The power of flight? The power to summon magical beasts? The things this mysterious power could be, there seemed to be almost endless possibilities of what it could be. She climbed a few small inclines and a very large and old tree stump, and there she was, at the ancient, sacred, and magical giant rune stone, hoping that the engravings in the rock would tell her something about her supposedly magic pendant. As she got closer to the rune stone in order to read the engravings more clearly, the runes started to suddenly glow an eerie light blue. Her pendant magically lifted off her neck, and towards the runestone, enveloped in the same blue glow. As it was hovering over the top of the stone, it flashed brightly, and then fell onto the ground as if nothing had ever happened in the first place. Rose, who was both confused and amazed by what she saw, picked up her pendant from the ground and slipped it back around her neck. She felt a strange tingle run through her body when it made contact with her skin. Rose then decided to go on a large adventure to all sorts of places to figure out what the magic locked inside her pendant could be and how to unlock said magic. But before she went to go on an adventure, she sent a letter to her mom with the help of a messenger raven to tell them that she was going to go on a quest to find out what this magic was and how to use it. Once that was out of the way, she felt like she was ready for her biggest adventure yet. She bolted out of the old moss-covered ruins and started heading towards Fang Mountain, where it is said an old and wise dragon lay. Maybe if she reached this wise dragon, it would know the answer to what type of magic might be in the pendant. She remembered the path to the mountain thanks to an old map in her village library. But since she was far outside the village, she had to rely on her brain to project a mental map of this map. If she remembered correctly, hopefully, she would make it there safely. The map she remembered seeing made it look easy and rather short due to the proportions that were drawn on it. Surely it can't be that bad, can it? So out she went, following the mental map that her brain had laid out for her to follow. There was a small dirt path that led out of the ruins, but after a while it came to an end, so Rose had to go off the path. She was pretty brave and naive for a girl her age, so she went off and ventured in the tall grass that followed suit. As she waded through the grass, she could hardly see anything in front or behind her. and her instincts were screaming at her to run and get out of this tall grass as quickly as possible, while another part of her mind was saying everything would be fine if she just stayed vigilant and aware of her surroundings. So she stopped for a short moment to calm herself down before continuing her path out of the grass. It felt like a while before she saw a clearing. Without looking, she tripped on something and clumsily tumbled out of the tall grass, and her face landed in a small puddle of mud. Both embarrassed and disgusted, she got up and grabbed a big enough leaf and wiped the sloppy mud off her face. Well, as much as she could remove with a leaf. As she looked around at her surroundings, she noticed after a few steps, that there was an absolutely massive gap between two pieces of land so far apart she had to squint her eyes a little in order to see the other side. But she had also noticed many floating islands of many different sizes strung about the very huge and very deep gap. While she was debating in her mind on whether she should cross it or not, she heard a chirp and turned around to see a small delivery wyvern that had come from her mother in order to give her a backpack full of water and food for her long trip. As soon as Rose put on the backpack, the wyvern went off back to the creature roost in her village. She felt a little more confident as she looked over the edge at the other side of the gap and took a leap of faith onto one of the nearby floating islands. She felt like she was going to miss it, but luckily she had nailed her landing. That landing had filled her brain with adrenaline and gained a boost in her confidence. And with that, she started leaping left to right on the floating island, slowly making her way to the other half of land, and soon enough, after a few more leaps, she had managed to make it to the other side, and with that she congratulating herself before passing out for a short while on the dirt due to exhaustion catching up to her after all that jumping. When she finally woke up after her body had filled itself with enough energy again, she slowly got back up off the ground and brushed the dirt off her clothes and got back onto her feet. The land all around her was a short yellow-green grass with what looked like a forest of some kind within her sight, and immediately started heading towards the trees amongst the soft grass. As she grew closer to the trees, she could clearly see the forest in front of her was a birch forest. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, continuing her path. Deep inside the birch woods, there was nothing but white bark in sight. To her, it felt almost endless, and the markings on the birch trees were not helping either. She just couldn't shake the feeling as if thousands of eyes were staring at her, watching her every move. Everywhere she looked, she saw the ever-watching eyes of all the trees around her. They were just staring and staring with a lot of creepy, unblinking eyes all around, always watching her. Rose felt very afraid, even if the eyes were just markings in the tree bark. It had felt all too real to her now, panicking an irrational mind. The eyes seeming to grow, get closer as she curled onto a ball on the forest floor, breathing rapidly, trying to calm herself down, trying to remind herself that none of this was real and that she would all be fine. Her breathing became slower and calmer as she cleared her mind of irrational thoughts. Once she felt nice and calm, with a clear mind, she slowly uncurled herself and got back onto her feet. And she ran, and so she could get out of the birch forest as fast as she could. Once she was out of the creepy trees and back on the short grass, she turned to face the forest and blew raspberries at it to show she did not like it at all, and went back on her merry way back to her venture. But even if she was now far away from that dreadful forest, a small part of her brain just could not let go of the feeling that something was still watching her. The path ahead of her was nice and calming, with lush green grass and a lot of colourful flowers that are in bloom all around her. Rose stopped momentarily to near a bright red rose to smell its pleasant odour for a short moment. Once she was done, she took in the amazing and beautiful sight of the flowers around her. The pleasant sights and smells made her feel quite happy and nice and calm compared to what her mood was in the forest. Clearly, this was a good place for her to calm down whenever she needed to. Sadly, she had to say goodbye to the wonderful field as she walked out of it and back onto normal and boring grass and dirt. Thankfully, it looked like to her she was nearing the bottom of Fang Mountain. Her end goal was now closer than it had ever been before, but that would have to wait for now, since it was getting rather dark, and poor Rose felt very, very tired. So she gathered up some leaves and soft mud to make a bed for her to sleep on for the night. In her dreams, Rose found herself on lush grass. As she looked everywhere around, there was nothing but a field of mirrors all around her everywhere she looked. Curious, Rose decided to walk up to one of the many mirrors. As she was now right in front of the dream mirror, she saw nothing at first, but then the glass wobbled like a small ripple in water. Once the wobbling had settled down, the mirror showed Rose something truly horrifying. Looking back at her in the mirror, it had a slimy, serpentine body, sprouting 6 insectoid wings, and a large gem embedded where its heart should be. It easily towered over the largest mountains, its hideous circular head sprouting over 1,000 beady, unblinking eyes, watching her through the glass, and its huge mouth was filled with many countless sharp teeth that seemed to spiral endlessly within its gaping maw, with the creature copying her every move inside the mirror. Rose was so terrified that she finally woke up from her truly awful nightmare. But even now that she was awake, she would never be able to get that image of the horrifying beast out of her young mind. Now fully awake, Rose watched the sun rise from the horizon before getting up, taking a nice stretch, and brushing off any leaves that had stuck to her clothing. Rose could not help but noticing that her pendant was now emitting a faint blue glow. Perhaps it had reacted to her nightmare and was doing something. Whatever that something was, Rose had no clue on what it did. As she looked closer at the pendant, she had now noticed that the emerald had a strange-looking symbol carved into the gemstone that was glowing. Rose thought perhaps that understanding the strange marking would be the key to unlocking the power within her magical pendant. Perhaps the wise dragon that is said to live here could tell her what it could mean and how to use it. So off she went, went very slowly, climbing her way up Fang Mountain, placing her feet on any rock she can find, with Rose's arm starting to hurt a little more the higher she went. Partway up the mountain, feeling completely exhausted and her limbs feeling like they became floppy, useless noodles, she took a break on a large grassy ledge on the mountainside, resting her limbs and taking her sweet time trying to catch her breath. To her, it felt like ages before her limbs and lungs felt good enough for her to continue up the mountainside, slowly, bit by bit, lifting herself and getting ever closer to the cavernous den where the dragon supposedly lived. Just as her arms and legs were starting to hurt to the point where they felt like they were going to pop off her body, she looked up to see that the den was close within her reach. And soon enough, Rose had gathered up enough strength and had finally made it to the dragon's den and entered it. Looking around, it was quite large, but rather empty. Rose had expected something like lots of gold and jewels laying around, but there was none of that anywhere. She walked deeper into the cave, and that's when she saw the large and old-looking skeletal remains of what was once a dragon laying still on the cave floor, gathering cobwebs. It looked like the stories of the wise dragon were true, but he was long gone by now, their bones now covered in a thin layer of dust, and a rusty sword lay amongst the bones. But not too far from the old dragon bones there was an ancient runestone and an old but well-kept large mirror.